Welcome back to this week's podcast for Crack the DAT, all things dental school, all things applying. So this week's super exciting. We're going to continue this series of applying to dental school and kind of just help with the journey that's happening right now. So this week we're talking about interviewing. That I know is a huge stressor for a lot of people. So hopefully this can help and kind of gear you in the right direction. So as I said, this week we're doing applying to dental school interviews. So I know the interview is super stressful and kind of seems like it's off in the far distance of the horizon, but I promise it's way, way sooner than you think it is. So I figured this would be a good time to talk and kind of introduce what you should expect in the interview process, and kind of you can look back at this video later and just kind of see, remind yourself some tips and tricks. There's a lot of resources out there, but I kind of wanted to provide my perspective on what my interview journey was like and kind of give the tips and tricks that I thought were most helpful for me when I went through this whole process a year ago. So first, before we begin, I wanted to just highlight some awesome things that Crack the DAT is doing right now. So they added some great things. So first, there's 100 new PAT floating cube questions. I know someone mentioned in one of the previous podcasts, they asked about the floating cube questions, and when I was going through the PAT, how to crack the PAT, I kind of briefly went over it and mentioned how it's really not that much different, and the approach to it isn't that much different, but there are different ways to tackle it, and getting exposure and then getting explanations for it is definitely the best way to approach it. So Crack the DAT offering 100 new floating cube questions is huge and definitely really great for exposure to those types of questions before you get to the real test. They do have explanations with the video or with the questions, so that's awesome and super great. Also, it's on mobile devices, so you can really do it anywhere. I know I talked about how helpful that was for me when I was going through my studying journey, is having the PAT practice on my phone. So really, whenever I had downtime, if I was taking a train or a flight or whatever, traveling or waiting or kind of in between things at dinner, and I was just going to be on my phone, or even in bed, I could just look at that. So having it on the mobile device is awesome. I also wanted to highlight the application services that Crack the DAT offers. Those are great and really helpful, especially now that people are applying and we're really in the crux of the application cycle. Like everything from personal statement help to primary and secondary edits, for your primary and secondary applications, for your personal statement application, interview prep even. So getting practice on interviews, which we'll talk about later, is so important. And definitely how you perfect your craft and perfect your answers is just practicing all the time and getting feedback. So those are awesome resources that Crack the DAT is also offering. So definitely get involved with those and look out for them and just use those resources that are available. So, as always with these weekly podcasts, 10% off code for this week is Crack Interview 10. So definitely use that and share it to your friends, just to get some savings and, get maximize benefits. Also, 50% off winner is going to be announced at the end. So stay tuned and definitely watch through the end. You'll get awesome tips and you will get the chance of being entered into the 50% off raffle. So stay tuned for the end for that as well. So kind of to begin this interview journey, I wanted to start with getting invited. So this is a super exciting time. I remember when I got my first interview invite, I was over the moon and I was just so elated that finally my hard work is paying off and that I was having the chance to really show off me and really give the school a very strong consideration, because I feel like when you're applying, you're kind of throwing your application out there. You're not really sure what you're going to hear back from, and then you get the interview and you're like, oh my gosh, like it's real. So I want to start with that because that's going to be coming up and that's super exciting. So first, it's on a rolling basis. With that being said, each school slightly does this differently. So what I mean by it's on a rolling basis is it if you apply in January, say, or in July, say, and they are having their first interviews, say, end of August, you can be invited for that interview August 1. If you apply August 15th, you're obviously not going to get that August 1 invite. So they kind of read their applications as they come and then extend invitations on a similar sort of rolling basis. And invites kind of start coming out in August. They pick up kind of throughout the fall, August, September, October as well. Some schools go and they interview and invite interviews until January. Some schools go into March. Most schools stop in December, so most schools have only like a few interview dates in January or February. But again, it really all depends on the school. Each school does this like slightly differently, so you really just got to make sure you're following your school and making sure you know what's happening with their deadlines. I know things are also a little bit different with coronavirus as well, since interviews are going to be online, and that's going to be definitely a difference. So with that being said, they might extend them differently. They might do different sort of interview dates, but I'm trying to giving my perspective into what I experienced. So December 15th, it was our acceptance day. So last year, December 15th, I think maybe the 14th, but December 15th was the day that schools extended their first acceptances. So most schools had interviewed most of their applicants that they were going to interview by that time so they could extend their acceptances. And then put you on wait lists or reject you. Rejections didn't come out, but acceptances came out that day. So once they extend their acceptances, I think you have a month to respond and accept the offer. And so if you don't accept the offer, that's when they start to extend more interview invites. So that's how you get the January, February, March invites. But those are after they fill majority of their class. So that's something to keep in mind as well with timing. But again, things might be slightly different and adjusted with COVID. So things might be like a little bit later or a little bit pushed back. Some schools only have a few dates. So some schools only have 3 interview dates. Some schools have dates every weekend. Some schools have dates multiple times a week. That all depends on the school and how they interview. So I know for me, some schools had interview days that had like 150, 200 kids, and there was only 3 dates. Other schools had 8 kids total, and you were the only ones there. It was very intimate and very small group. Other schools were in between, so other schools had like 20 people. Every school kind of does it differently. So you kind of just need to, again, pay attention to the school. So it depends. It really depends. Also, some schools let you choose what date you go, so they'll offer you 3 dates. Some schools won't choose, and they'll pick for you and say, "Hey, you've been invited to interview on this date." So that's kind of something to keep in mind as well. And I've always gotten this question. I had this question. I never came into this situation, luckily, but I have had friends who've had the situation. And it's a tough one, but if you get 2 dates on the same day, so 2 interview invites on the same day, you have to pick the school, prioritize the school that you'd prefer to go to, and then let the other school know that you can't make that date. But you need to know that, or keep in mind that there's no guarantee you'll get another invite. So, for example, the schools that only do 3 interview dates the entire application cycle, if you say no to an interview date, you're going to be put back into the pool to be considered in the next interview date. But if they don't have another interview date, then you kind of lost your opportunity. So that's something that you have to kind of personally weigh and personally figure out what you want to do in that scenario. So general tips for interview day. So I kind of want to start after getting invited. I wanted to start in just general tips. So I have 1,000 different thoughts and advice and pieces, and just kind of wanted to get the ball rolling and get my feet wet, kind of, so to speak, just to kind of have some jumping points and get you guys have some tips. And then we'll kind of go into like different types of interviews. that you could experience and what to expect with those. But these are just my general tips, which I feel like everyone should hear, at least from me, hopefully multiple times, not from just me, but just information and tips that I found super helpful when I was doing the whole interview process. So, excuse me. The first piece of advice I have is be polite. So that one should probably obviously be pretty self-explanatory and intuitive. I hope that you know to be polite. But what I kind of wanted to highlight with be polite is be polite to everyone. So from the moment you get there, every person you talk to every person you interact with, just be polite, be nice, be respectful, be conscientious, and considerate, because this kind of goes into the last little bullet of your interview starts the moment you arrive. But it really truly does, and I'll save that till I get there. But just be polite to every person you encounter, because you don't know who's watching truly. You don't know who's evaluating you. Be punctual. So that's a huge one. I don't know if anyone's – I know probably people have heard of the phrase be fashionably late. Obviously, that does not apply in interview situations. But I remember I was showing up at like one of my second interviews maybe, and I was walking from my hotel. It was an out-of-state interview, and I was walking from my hotel, and I was like 15 minutes early. I had gotten to the place 15 minutes early, and I was like, oh, like, man, I really don't want to be like the first one there and like only one there, and like having to make small talk and be awkward and nervous and whatever. So I took like a little walk around the block and ended up being probably like 8 minutes early instead of 15. And I was the last one to arrive. So I promise you everyone else is going to be early. That's kind of what I learned from that experience, is that you're not actually early. And I had this one person tell me a saying that if you're early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late. If you're late, you're lost. So I think that's really true to be the case for interviews, is that if you're early, you're on time. So just make sure you're early and that you get there with ample time. Also, the other thing too is if they say to be there 15 minutes before, be there 20 minutes before. Don't really hit the nail on the head of what they say. Be early, and that shows punctuality, that shows accountability, that shows time management, that shows a lot of things to the interviewer. So you just want to make sure that you're prompt and that you're punctual. Next is be prepared. So know what they want you to bring and have it. So be prepared is on a lot of facets really important. So we'll talk more later about the be prepared of know yourself and know what your answers are, know your experiences. But what I mean by be prepared in this sense is I mean physically be prepared. So I had some schools request a passport size photo of myself. I had some schools request pens. I had some schools request something else. I had a little notebook that I had to take notes down, and that was really important to me, is having to jot down like things I liked about the school, things I didn't like a place to write down the interviewer's contact information, just stuff like that. Be prepared. Know what they want you to bring, have the documentation that they need. You don't ever want to walk into a situation and not have something they need. I had a smaller interview. I think there was probably like 8 kids, and they asked us to bring a small photo of ourselves with like this like document. And one person had forgotten it, and there was only 8 of us. So when the director of admissions literally walked around and was like, "Hi, can I have your whatever? Can I have your whatever?" Every single person, but one person didn't have it, and it just was noticeably uncomfortable. It was one of those things where you were like, "Okay, well that was clearly an avoidable mistake." So it would have taken 2 extra minutes to read the email we got a couple months ago. So just be prepared on what to have and have it. Know what you wrote on your application. So that's kind of another be prepared, but in a different way. So we're going to talk about this, but some interviews are open note, open file, and if they ask you a question about your application, if you highlighted something that you didn't actually fully do that well, or you didn't remember, most of the time you're going to be applying in midsummer. So you're applying around now into August. And then sometimes you're not going to interview until December. So that's like a substantial amount of months that you're doing school, you're working, you're traveling, you're doing something else where you're not thinking about your application. and then you get to the interview and they ask you a question about something you highlight on your application and you totally forgot what you said. You don't want to ever contradict yourself in an interview. So definitely just know what you wrote on your application. So what I did for this in particular, I printed out my application. So I printed out my primary and my secondaries for each school. And before I went, I had a little printout of it. And I would lay in bed before my interview night, like the night before my interview. I would lay in bed if I was in a hotel or friend's house or my house or whatever. I would lay in bed and I would go through the printout of what I had and I would highlight things. And I would take little notes and say, like, star, like, good to answer this question, like, make sure highlight this, like, stuff like that, where I just was rereading what I wrote so many times that I just knew exactly what I was saying, like the back of my hand. And I know that's kind of, it sounds silly to say know what you wrote because you're writing about yourself, but truthfully, like, you're trying to highlight everything about yourself. And it's really easy in a high tense, high stress situation to forget or to not remember what exactly you said. So I found that to be really, really helpful.
The SN1 reaction is the
In keyholes or apertures, you're given an object.
Figure out the molar mass of it. So we were given the mass, and you get.
Next, your interview starts from the moment you arrive. So this is what I was kind of talking about earlier, and this is, I think, so incredibly important. And I think it's also really hard for people to know or to realize. And it's really important for people to realize is that everyone is watching you and evaluating you. So from the people who welcome you, who introduce you, who sit there and kind of direct you where to go, down to the students who you interact with, to the volunteers, everyone who you encounter from the school is a part of the admissions team in some facet and who is making that day, creating that day for you. And they're all watching you. So you need to treat every single person, even the other interviewers, actively and engaged and with respect and as if they are a direct interviewer, as if they're a part of the decision that whether or not you're going to be accepted. Kind of, I think a good example that I like to tell people about this too is you need to treat your other interviewees too with respect and just well, because an example I like to say is I have a friend who works in admissions, and she was saying that they were doing an admissions day for med school, and one of the admissions officers was setting up the catered lunch for everyone to have, all the interviewees to have. And she was setting up the lunch, and there was some banter going on between the two interviewees, and she was so turned off by it that she like told someone about it and told another person, another admissions ambassador about it, and they decided to report it and told them that they needed to report that the admissions committee likes to know stuff like that because, right, how you act when you think no one's watching is how you truly act. And so those interviewees did not think other people were watching them, but even the person who was providing the food and setting up the food for them to eat got an insight into who they truly were when no one was watching, and that ended up hurting their chances of getting into the school. So just always be on your toes and really have your A game on from the moment you walk in to the moment you leave. Every single person that you encounter is going to be a part of your decision in some way or another. So definitely just be on your A game. Next thing I like to say is don't dwell on things. So it's super easy to get in your head, especially on interview days when everything's stressful. If you didn't answer a question that you wanted to answer in a specific way, and then you remember later on that you wanted to answer in this way, or you didn't love the way you interacted with that random guy when you walked in, or you maybe were super dazed and you were coming out of the bathroom and stressed or something, and you like have a negative interaction, don't dwell on those little things, because ultimately having you dwell throughout your interview day is just going to cause more harm than good. Let things go, live in the moment, and just really try to be your best self in every moment that you can during your interviews. So more practice, and this speaks to the kind of what I was saying earlier about Crack the Dat and the admissions application services that Crack the DAT does is you want to practice for interviews. You want to say every answer you have to every question, to every possible question, to 100 different people. You want to get everyone's feedback. You want to kind of formulate and work on crafting and perfecting the art of how you present your information. And you want to get everyone's opinion, because honestly, the more you practice, the more comfortable you get at talking about yourself, at highlighting things, at not stumbling, at speaking fluently, at perfecting eye contact, non-verbal body cues, just stuff like that. It's not fully natural, and some people it comes easier than others, but just practicing a lot is just really important to making sure that you're presenting the best version of yourself on interview day. Google the school and prepare answers to commonly asked questions. So I would always look at Student Doctor Network, but if you Google the school and you Google interview questions, there's 100 different resources that provide commonly asked questions or questions that were asked during their specific interview day. And I would always go through school by school before my interviews and write down the questions that were new, that I hadn't seen, or that I don't necessarily knew I would know the answer to right off the bat. And I would just sit there for a minute, formulate an answer, and then I would go practice with my friends. So just being prepared for whatever the school could throw at you is definitely really important. Also, each school kind of has its own little quirks about what kind of questions they ask or what weird question they ask. So being able to be prepared for that is definitely helpful. Run the answers by your family and friends. I already kind of talked about that, just practicing. Try answering in front of the mirror to see if you do anything funny while answering questions. I had a friend recommend me do this, and it was very actually insightful. When I was talking, I was looking at myself, and you kind of see what you do with your nonverbal cues. You see if you talk with your hands, if you make weird faces, if you kind of smile, don't smile, or too enthusiastic, not enthusiastic enough, how you hold yourself, your posture. It's just a really interesting way to watch yourself answer and kind of see what you do with your nonverbal. And just kind of look for big glaring, things that aren't necessarily like what you want to present yourself as. Don't necessarily memorize answers, just know the key things you want to highlight. So one thing that you definitely don't want to be is robotic, and you don't want to sound like you've rehearsed this and you've practiced this. Just kind of have ideas or moments that you want to highlight or that you want to reflect on, and that can be used to answer multiple questions. And then once the question's asked, however it's phrased, in whatever facets it's phrased, kind of use your experiences and your little back pocket examples and just weave them into the questions. Don't have set memorized answers to questions, because maybe the question will be phrased slightly differently. So you're going to have to rework it and kind of play with it and make sure it molds into the question, not necessarily just a robotic memorized answer. That goes into the have a few examples in your back pocket you can spin for most things. So just having those examples that you're able to then fit into the realm of the question that that is being asked of you.
Succeed on your dental admission test. Study less and score higher. Check Crack the DAT now at crackdat.com.
Ask them questions, be engaged and move the conversation. Don't be robotic. So they give you an opportunity, and sometimes this is the majority of the interview too, which is really intimidating, but they give you an opportunity to ask them questions. So definitely have questions prepared. But if you ask them a question and they go on a tangent about something else, don't then go 360 backflip into something else that's totally irrelevant that you just remembered that you memorized as a question you wanted to ask. Kind of pry within that. What interests you? Can you elaborate on that? How did you get into this route? Oh, you mentioned this. Like, what did you think about this? Kind of use that to build into the conversation so it seems conversational and you seem like a real person, not like a robot that memorized answers. So now we're going to go into different types of interviews. So we have the closed file interview. So the closed file interview is you go into an interview and they've never looked at your file and they don't know anything about you. So they haven't read your file. So this one was kind of hard for me. And when I had a closed file interview, I was a little bit thrown off because you have to assume they know nothing, right? And you have to present everything about you. But you kind of already wrote everything about yourself in the interview. But then you have to take a step back and say, okay, this person knows nothing about me. So you have to give them the background they need. So if you say, give me an example of a time you've been empathetic. And then you say, in my work and blah, I do this. Here's how I'm empathetic. Like, you have to set up the scenario in which you're giving them the answer. You can't just go to the answer. And really sell yourself. That's the other thing in closed file interviews is they really know nothing about you, so they're looking for you to have the passion. Whereas if someone's read your file, they can ask you and see how passionate you are about something. This one, you really just need to throw your heart into the answers. So open files, I would say, in my personal opinion, a little easier than closed file. And I say that because the interview has had the chance to look at your file or has it with them, and they ask questions about directly what's on your file. So whatever you put in your application, you clearly are passionate about and you clearly have done, so you can speak to those experiences. So I think that's a little easier because they're going to ask you directed questions or pointed questions at certain things that you've done. And obviously you've done them, so you're going to be able to talk about them easier than them saying this open-ended question where you have to kind of fill in the blanks. You still need to assume that they haven't read everything. So if they say, tell me about your experience in blah, assume that they maybe just saw the title blah. Assume that they didn't read your little blurb about it, that they don't know exactly what you've done, and sell your passion for that thing. Feel free to elaborate on things, provide deeper insight and understanding of yourself. So don't assume that just because you've kind of already said it that you can't show how truly passionate you are about that. Drawing connections to more things you've done. Don't be a regurgitating robot of what you've already written on your application. Clearly they've read your application, so kind of provide the story. And that's what I mean by the last thing, show, don't tell. So provide the story, provide the background, provide the color to the picture. Don't just sit there and say, I did X. So the next kind of interview is a student interview. So this is when the student interviews you instead of a faculty or a staff member. This is still an interview, and I think that's hard because they are ultimately only a few years or the same age as you or even younger than you. But it is still an interview, and you still need to respect them because ultimately they are, like I said, every single person is a part of your decision. So be polite, be respectful. Treat them like adults. Treat them like they are your faculty interviewers. And also really use this time to get their insights. So ask them questions about student life. Ask them about what they do in their free time. Ask them about their life, and kind of use that as a good guider of how the student body is and how, like, could you see them being your best friend? Could you see them being your friend? Would you want them to be a classmate? What's the dynamic? And that's a good opportunity to hear a student's perspective, but also try to wow them. Ultimately, you are trying to have them want you as a classmate as well. So it's kind of a back and forth. But do ultimately, I think, really importantly, respect them and treat them as if they are a very serious interviewer, because they are. So MMIs, I never actually interviewed any school that had an MMI. I did do an MMI workshop just in case, but none of the schools that I applied to were offering MMIs. MMIs are multiple mini interviews. They're less common. They are less common, but some schools do them. It's multiple mini interviews. So this is when you walk into a room and you read a scenario and you have to respond. And there's one person in there, multiple people in there. You're just it kind of shows how you act on your feet. It's role playing. A lot of them are ethical scenarios. Things that they're looking for are clear communication in team settings and your ability to think on your feet. One big piece of advice that I was given, and I also would love to share with others, is that you want to really know your personal opinions and your standpoints, your viewpoints on things. You're going to be put in like tough ethical situations that kind of render different approaches and different sides, and you want to kind of know where you stand on a lot of issues before you go in, so that when you do encounter something, you're not pliable, that you can take a stance. But it also is important to see both sides of the story. So last type of interview is a panel interview. This one also is very less common. It's you and it's a panel of interviewers, so it's like 4 interviewers and then you. The 80-20 rule is what I've been told about this, is that whoever asks the question, you give them 80% of your time and then 20% of your time to everyone else in the room. This kind of just shows your ability to engage in multiple people. Being a presenter, being open to engaging with everyone and kind of panning back and forth is important here. Try to connect with each panelist as much as you can. I know it's awkward because there's four of them, one of you, but being able to draw little comparisons between a question asked there or an insight given here or whatever, and being able to make it into a conversational thing instead of a pointed question, answer. So last thing that I love to tell people, and I think that this is so incredibly important, is always follow up with your interviewers after the interview. So always get their email address, their phone number, whatever, and write a little thank you. Thank you for your time. Include a personal anecdote about something that you bonded over, or some insight they gave you, or something that would be helpful for you, and draw the connection of why that's important. And then thank them for their time again, and that you are excited about the opportunity. That's super important, and that follows up, and that just shows you're interested and shows that you care and that you are professional. So that's super important, and I think that's a huge piece of advice that I would give to people. So now we're at the end of this week's podcast. As always, here's the discounts to crack the DAT. 10% off use the code apply. Oh, I mean the interview one, and then 50% off when we're announced too. So bye.